back to the conversation stage. Our next session about AI and security is really topical given the ongoing events in Ukraine. And I'm also conscious that this showcase and the Institute bears the name of Alan Turing, whose work was so important in this area. So AI and cybersecurity are becoming a key battleground in defence and has a hugely important role to play in the resilience of the UK. In this fascinating session, which I'm really looking forward to, we'll be exploring the role of AI and cybersecurity in keeping societies and citizens safe, and the challenges of operating in a space that has so many actors, whether they're nation states, state-sponsored groups, or loosely organised collectives of individuals. The panel today will be hosted by Dr. Alexander Blanchard, who is Research Fellow in the Digital Ethics Programme at the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory. Alexander is also with the Turing Institute. So, Alexander, over to you.
Hi, thank you very much for having us at AIUK. I'm very pleased to introduce our panel discussion today on AI security and international peace in challenging times. As you say, an incredibly topical subject and one which is incredibly important and which I look forward to addressing with our experts today. AI is finding a range of actual and potential uses in the defense and security domain, from AI-enabled intelligence analysis to the use of autonomy in weapon systems. And whilst this presents many opportunities, it can also outpace the norms we have around the use of these technologies. So I'm delighted to be joined by my speakers today to talk about some of the opportunities presented by AI, but also some of those practical, ethical, and social challenges which the use of AI in defense and security can present. The format for the panel today is more conversation-based. We invite audience questions. In fact, we very much hope it will be audience-led. So please, if you have a question or one off the top of your head that you would like to field, put it into the question box. We'll start by, I'll introduce the speakers and give you a brief bio, and then the speakers will have a chance for a few minutes to talk about their work and their research. And then we will go into taking audience questions and discussing the themes of the panel, but also the questions which are raised by the research of our experts. So firstly, I'd like to introduce to you Al Brown. Al is a visiting fellow at Oxford University, researching command and control in human and machine systems. Al led a study for defense on the global strategic trends in robotics and artificial intelligence and its impacts on conflict. And he has previously been one of a group of government experts providing advice to and speaking at the United Nations. He is also an occasional guest lecturer at RUSI and the Alan Turing Institute. And Al has also produced a book on global strategic trends in artificial intelligence. Dr. Elke is a senior lecturer in political theory at Queen Mary, University of London. Her research focuses on the intersection of ethics of war and technology, with an emphasis on unmanned and autonomous military technologies, as well as their impact on the politics of contemporary warfare. Over the last decade, Elke has been involved in a number of policy initiatives on drones and autonomous weapons, and she is the author of Death Machines, The Ethics of Violent Technologies. She is currently a member of the International Committee for Robot Arms Control and is CAPAS Fellow at the University of Heidelberg. And lastly, but by no means least, Oliver Lewis is co-founder of Rebellion Defense, which is a British-American software company building artificial intelligence products for defense and national security. Previously, Oliver was Deputy Director of the UK Government Digital Service, where he worked on implementing emerging technologies across government. And early in his career, Oliver was a Ministry of Defense intelligence officer, policy advisor, and strategy advisor. And he has also had 2 deployments to Afghanistan. So as I said, I certainly hope we'll be taking audience questions today. So please do put those into the question box if you have any. First, though, I'd like to allow the speakers some time to talk about their work and what they do, to give us more of a background on the things they've been doing. So if we could start with Al, if you could introduce yourself and talk about these areas that you've been working on, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here and an honour to be invited, so thank you. So I am interested in combinations of humans and machines and how decisions get made and how perception works across dislike elements. And I find it's quite often really unhelpful that the conversations and the perceptions of how these things arrive sort of drift towards technological determinism, arguing about a single technological product. And the reality is that conflict doesn't occur that way. It's not something that's segregated and distinct from people or society or any of those things. So it's it's often the point of interface between the human and machine, how attention plays a huge part in those decision-making roles, how volumes of information are integrated, what gets retained, what gets discarded, and that works as well, not just as the individual person and the individual machine, because almost never is that the case in any kind of combat system, but across organizations as well. So groups of people and groups of machines and how they pass that stuff together, and how that turns into a perception that turns into things like decision-making, memory, action, and a lot of those sorts of themes. So that's one of the areas I look at, which gives me a huge amount of scope to look at lots of stuff.
That's all very interesting, Al. Fantastic. Elke, if you would introduce your research and some of your key questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Alex, and thank you so much for the invitation to take part in this conversation. It's a timely conversation, especially at our particular times, but also because the latest meeting of the group of governmental experts on lethal autonomous weapon systems in Geneva has just concluded, although in an unusual way. So thinking through these technologies is really important. So not unlike Al, I am also interested in the human-machine nexus. So I've been looking at this digital technologies and specifically the ethics of digital technologies and autonomous weapon systems for the better part of 10 years now. And I'm really interested in the role of agency, in particular moral or ethical agency, and what happens to that agency when we are embedded within digital ecologies as such. And I'm interested in perhaps how the characteristics of the technology itself pose somewhat of a challenge to our ability to be moral agents or to exercise moral agency, because I think that's an important issue that is often overlooked, that also touches on the question of whether we can actually exert meaningful human control over AI-enabled targeting systems, for example. And I also look at how the logic of digital interfaces and infrastructures perhaps have a capacity to direct our human thinking in line with the schematics of digital protocols, and how that directs how we conceive of ethics or how we think ethically. And that is something that has a longer historical trajectory that isn't just specific to AI, but is kind of embedded in modern times, if you will. So in the past 5 years or so, that has become my research focus, not least because I sometimes am a little bit frustrated that discussions on military AI, especially those centering on AI in lethal military applications, tend to work with a reasonably limited idea of what ethics is or can be, and tend to prioritize really a very instrumentalist view of how we as humans work with or fit within digital technologies. Maybe more on that later. But I'm pivoting in my current research also to look a little bit more at how the logic of the technology sector itself has a lot to do with how future military operations and practices are envisioned. And I think that's something important to look at in the drive or in this ostensible AI, military AI arms race as such, because I do believe it has implications for the possibility of peace overall. I leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elke. That was very interesting. Oliver, if you wouldn't mind introducing the work you've been doing.
Thanks, Alex. I think in those moments where I still pretend to be an academic, I'm interested in the depiction of defense and national security in popular culture. And what becomes apparent when you look at how military technologies are depicted in films, television, and games is that there's an extraordinary gap between those popular culture depictions and the reality in military organizations across the world. And so it's no surprise that non-specialists interested in, say, the application of artificial intelligence in military dimensions has a perception that it's rampant, there's extraordinary levels of it, and we should be all terrified of it. I think the reality for the military and in the intelligence space is it's more often a poverty of technology than it is a surfeit of advanced technologies. And so if I think back to when I left Afghanistan back in for the last time in 2012, a decade ago, I would often say to friends to explain the headquarters experience that it would be quicker if we were to use pen and ink to do many of the intelligence activities or decisions than it was trying to use our laptops. Sadly, 10 years later, I visited a military organization recently, and it looks largely the same, with perhaps 3 exceptions. 1, there weren't enough laptops to go around for all the analysts. 2, it was poor access to the internet, possibly worse than Helmand. And 3, no one in that analytical community knew how to gain access to the software licenses that the Ministry of Defense had already procured. So that's the reality of what the military are currently dealing with when it comes to technology. And so when we fixate on conversations around, say, exactly what Elke said, killer robots, like the lethal aspect of it, we're missing not only what's required to improve basic capabilities of analytical decision-making, so not making mistakes when you copy names between Excel spreadsheets, we're missing the benefits that could be derived from getting advanced in that, but also we miss, therefore, looking at the ethical issues around that level of automation, really quite basic levels of automation that will determine how decisions are made. Thanks, Alex.
Thank you very much. Okay, so that's very interesting. So we have a sort of conversion there around being wary that AI is not a silver bullet, so to speak, to concerns about technological determinism and where human agency lies amongst the use of converging technologies. We have some questions coming in, but I just want to pose to you very quickly, take the sort of chair's license here, which is what you seem to all be expressing is that there has to be a sort of there has to be a bit of a realism about what technologies like AI can and cannot do. And I just really briefly want to ask each of our panelists what, in that case, you think are one of the key opportunities that AI may present, but also one of the key challenges you may present, thinking about that coming from your own work. And then we have a question from someone in the audience about the arms race, which we'll move into. But first, I just want to ask about that. Well, if you think, or what the key opportunity could be, and what the key challenge, just one of each, if that's okay, just for consideration of time. Oliver, can I go with you first?
Absolutely. In terms of key opportunities, I think it is in the possibility of freeing the human mind in defense and intelligence to do what it's best at, and that's dealing with complex issues and being creative in decision making. Whereas the majority of participants within, say, the military intelligence complex spend an extraordinary amount of their time just doing basic triage of information. And usually in a way that there's not even as advanced as on our smartphones. So the mind, for those people, doesn't flourish. It can't do the types of high-level cognition that we would assume and we would hope it to do so. Even more so if you think of, say, some quite acute intelligence tasks with extraordinary numbers of people to sort of examine, and yet you'll typically work through your workflow in quite a linear way because you have quite poor software, if you have software at all. And therefore you might finally discover the important thing at 4 o'clock on a Friday, rather than 9 o'clock on a Monday, where if you have basic technology, there could be a level of prioritization of the types of intelligence that you need to assess. I think that the challenge aspect of that is, frankly, in the marshalling of the data. So it's making the data accessible. It's making the data accessible in some cases to government, because it's often held by contractors or systems integrators who've never been asked for it, even if they are contractually obliged to give it. And then even if you can access it, it is looking at the quality of that data, particularly because defense data will be inevitably very narrow, and it's highly unlikely that the defense user is aware of the biases that are present in that data.
Yes, okay, absolutely. You see a lot of work today about, or the potential promise of AI being around freeing up people from those sort of mundane tasks, those sort of repetitive, highly laborious tasks, sort of free up the use of creativity in other areas. Could I put the same question to you as well, Elke? What you see as a key benefit, but also, well, a key opportunity, but also a key challenge?
Yeah, I would agree with this. The opportunity aspect really is to utilize artificial intelligence, similar technologies, automation technologies, to alleviate repetitive, clearly delineated tasks that just take up a lot of time and manpower, or human power, so to speak, right? So that keep people busy in ways that could be made much more efficient. So any task that benefits from optimization and efficiency, whether that's logistics, supply chain management, I would imagine there's ways in which predictive maintenance benefits from artificial intelligence in military operation, all that kind of stuff is really, I think is a great opportunity, and relatively, given the, appropriate infrastructure and cloud computing capabilities and all that kind of stuff, which is a big if. That's good. The challenges, of course, is something I'll probably focus on a little bit more. For me, the challenge is really to push against this hyperbolic discourse that is happening around artificial intelligence as a panacea for everything at the moment, and understanding, really truly taking seriously the limitations. And this discourse is coming again, there are certain, I think, Oliver, it's such a good point you've raised about the actual limitations of technological infrastructure. And yet we hear all kinds of future visions of a, fully networked, AI-ready war-fighting force, as it was in the National Security Commission's AI report. That's the idea. And I think that's the dangerous idea, because you'll end up with immature technologies. You'll put the technologies to use somewhere where they cause a lot of harm rather than good, perhaps because they need to be trialed, because combat tested technology is always worth more than, and so on and so forth. So drawing the limitations, that's where, and the limits, that's where I see the greatest challenges in this arena.
I do want to pick you up in a minute shortly and to unpack the point about the hyperbole around AI in the context of our next question from the audience. But I just want to allow Al to come in and just delineate what he thinks is a key opportunity and a key challenge.
So I think, I'm not sure I'm going to necessarily answer the question in that frame, but what it's prompted me to think about is sort of carrying on the theme of the realities of conflict. And I think current events are a really good sort of expose of what are real trends and what are the things that are often written in national security documents that sound super aspirational, verging on science fiction. And if you were to take a look at the Ukraine conflict, you would find it to be one of the most transparent wars that I think we have witnessed in our time. And the sheer volume of material that is available through open source information, we do not tend to think of as an AI thing. And that is because we tend to, as soon as the technology is real and it is with us, it falls out of the bracket of being AI. We normally categorize these things as, AI is that which normally requires a human to do. And what that definition also means is we think it's abnormal for a machine. And as soon as the machine's doing it, it's not abnormal, and therefore it's not AI. But if you were to take someone from 5 years ago and say, you will have more video footage of events in a Russian war than you could possibly hope to analyse, with not just every intelligence officer that was available in the British military, but pretty much all of the British military sitting and watching screens all day, every day. That would have been viewed as absurd. And it's the reality of what we've got now. And you have challenges that come with that, because there's a limited amount of policing that is possible on an open source network that's arriving from anywhere. And yet there are hosts of citizens who are on there who are using things like reverse image search, another thing that we don't think of as AI, but it is weeding out things that, they appear on the screen. Everybody says, oh, that's terrible, this has happened. And someone says, no, that's the explosion from Beirut. What are you talking about? And it gets debunked almost as quickly. So I think there's going to be a lot of, so one of the, I don't know, opportunities is the right word, but definitely one of the real trends, one of the things that AI will do is it's going to change the game of hide and seek that has been warfare for a long time. It's going to make a lot more things visible. And who can see that is going to change as well. So I suspect if you're a Ukrainian infantryman, you've probably got a radio that gives you some information, and you've probably got a phone that gives you an awful lot of other information as well. And you probably find both of them invaluable at this point, depending on when you're turning them on or not. The challenge is, I think, they're a sort of mirror of that in some ways, in that the idea that war is somehow segregated from any of the changes in society are also tied to, society is really all of us as individuals, and the individuals in society have their views formed by what they experience. We're all complex adaptive systems. And, this is not really evidential data in the sense of a widespread summary, but I, like most people, have a family member who should probably be denied access to the internet, because the opinions he forms and the things he thinks are true are truly awful on any given subject that's come up. So, immediately an ivermectin enthusiast as soon as we had the pandemic, that sort of thing. But he's not alone, and he's quite common, and they form a source of pressure in society that changes decision-making in organizations, and it changes decision-making in politics. And it's because how information arrives at individuals is shaped and changed by systems that are interacting with those populations on reward functions that are very difficult for society to get a grip of in any meaningful way. And I think those are going to be some of the greater challenges with conflict. And probably the one other one I think that's going to relate to that is, we quite often think of defense and security challenges as, as I said, what will the weapon that we design of the future be? But we also have to look at the effects of the changes in value of labor versus the changes in value of capital, and what that starts to do to society. So as, wherever we've seen, so a classic example will be sort of black cab drivers used to get paid a lot of money for the knowledge, for the ability to navigate the warren that is London. And we've seen court cases about the working terms and conditions for Uber drivers, where the skills were devalued, and they ended up living a vastly worse, or certainly financially less rewarded, lower esteem, all those sorts of things. And low esteem and low money and changes to those sorts of term conditions change dynamics in society. And that doesn't feel like an AI and security issue, because it feels like, something to do with labor relations. But I think that's a trend that I think is going to be very real. So I think there's a lot of stuff that almost looks mundane, but is likely to carry on and become an increasing defense and security issue in wider society.
I particularly like that how your response suggests that the sort of simple question I'm posing about a binary between benefits and challenges doesn't really make sense when you're introducing novel capabilities and novel effects into a domain. But also the way in which you're suggesting that it's not enough to treat armed conflict as this distinct sphere, that actually you have to be undertaking these holistic analysis of what is going on in broader society to think about how these technologies are going to play out in armed conflict. I'm going to take a question from the audience now from Jonathan Van Dyke. Bearing in mind the point we've just had from all of you actually, stressing the need to sort of be careful about the hyperbole. Jonathan has asked the question about the arms race, and he's couched it as conditional. Jonathan asks, Is there an AI arms race? And if so, what dangers and safeguards does this pose? Is there an AI arms race? Who would like to take that that question first? One that always comes up. But okay, Al, do you want to give us some thoughts on that initially, and then we'll take it.
I'll try to be quick. So it's slightly dangerous to couch it in the same methodology of thinking about things like the sort of missile gap and things that are associated with nuclear weapons. Firstly, because in that instance, you were talking about things that were the monopoly of the state. So you can't nip down to the shops and buy plutonium. The state owned all of the scientists, be that the USSR or the USA or whoever. Fundamentally different in the sense that it exists largely outside the state. So you heard Oliver's very accurate description of government employees being unable to access government programs that were already owned. Completely different in an environment where large international companies own most of the talent, they have the most of the resources. There's no monopoly on any of these systems. Also interesting in the sense that it also bypasses some of the boundaries that existed in academia. So Cornell University's hosted archive means anyone can get almost any research on AI, which is completely different to some of the arms races ideas. That's not to suggest that there aren't elements of a race involved in it, and that there are not dangers in it as well. And I think there is some really good work looking at the dangers of things like the alignment problem that are going to be really important, but will exist over a very long-term period. And I'll stop now because I'll steal all the time otherwise.
Yeah, and perhaps I come in at this point. There's diverging ideas as to whether there actually is an AI arms race or whether there isn't, or whether that's just, again, zhuzhed up into an arms race because it's quite productive for some and less productive for others. But I really want to refocus our attention perhaps not to the question or away from the question whether there is an AI arms race, but rather who pushes those narratives and who benefits from us, being engaged in an AI arms race. And obviously we have to look at the technology sector here, and I've been following the work that the National Security Council on AI has been doing, the advocacy work that Eric Schmidt has been doing over the last 5 years, and really sort of trying to AIify all things military. And with that come a lot of problems. With this narrative comes a lot of rerouting of financial allocations, perhaps away from those places that it's most needed and onto technologies that are unproven and unsure what they're going to do or indeed what they're going to solve in the long run. I've already mentioned immature or faulty technologies. Whenever states are racing to produce an emerging technology first, chances are there's not enough testing, not rigorous enough oversight, and so on and so forth. It's questions of proliferation of this immature technology and so on. It really poses huge advantages for those that aggressively come into this market. Palantir, Anduril, Clearview, those kinds of new military type startups, but it presents a huge challenge to global stability, and including nuclear stability. I have my doubts whether there's a true AI arms race actually on, for all the reasons that have already been mentioned, but it is worth paying attention who benefits. It's always a good question to ask anyways.
I think just as one of those people that I hope collectively, commercially will benefit from it, I think that's a mutual alignment of interests, given the reality of that technology poverty that exists within our respective militaries and the rise of authoritarian capitalist challenges to that. I actually agree with Elke that I don't think there is an AI arms race, but I'm also grateful for the narrative, because of all of the moments that we've attempted significant military technological reform, largely since the 1960s, they've failed. And the type of catalysm that's occurring as a consequence of this fear seems to be generating far more ability to change existing systems that typically only to the benefit of a small number of existing defense contractors that have largely remained same since the 1960s, 1970s. So I kind of at the moment think it's worth the cost of this form of misdirection or even misinformation. There is, though, I think, a race around the commercial export of particularly technologies around facial recognition. And that worries me a great deal, because if you look at the level of export of software developed with the support of the Chinese state into the African continent and other places over the last 6-7 years, it's a significant number of sales, particularly supported in coercive regimes. And our absence in those commercial markets is only to the detriment of those populations and to the detriment of our own national interest.
Elke, I just wondered if you wanted to come back about Oliver's point on narrative there, given what you had said.
Yes, I understand the point Oliver seeks to, or you seek to make, Oliver. And I would agree that it's interesting to look at, okay, you know, things are being shaken up, and that's a good thing, right? Things are modernized, and perhaps a narrative helps spur interaction, a type of modernization that is long overdue. But I would also be quite hesitant to think that there won't be positions in which companies will sell their technology, you know, to the highest bidder in any kind of market, right? So I think with a destabilization of the defense sector through these new innovative pathways, new challenges will always arise. There isn't necessarily, despite all efforts to cast it in, okay, these are the problematic actors and these are the good actors, that's not necessarily as clear cut, right? So US companies might sell to Chinese companies. US companies might sell to dictatorships. So there isn't a good and bad side. There isn't a safe or unsafe side. There's just a fast-paced sector in which there's a lot of financial gain. And so that's what worries me a little bit. That's not to say that what you're doing in your defense sector is not absolutely applaudable, but looking at the picture as a whole and looking at the challenges of global stability that this might produce, I am a little bit worried.
So if it might make you simultaneously depressed and reassured to have the thought, try and go and find an NAO audit report on defense procurement that says they did it too quickly, because I've never seen one, and it's arguably worse in the US DoD. So so Oliver's sort of, I guess, reassurance about tempo being far too far the other way, I think is probably where the needle sits at the moment. It's definitely worth keeping in mind those defense and security, or the assurance issues that go with it. And I think you probably find that, again, you might find that all places are not equal in this, in that, you know, I'm speculating, but there is a vastly rigorous system in countries with large professional civil servant organizations where the reward function is absolutely about ensuring something is assured to the nth degree of safety, security, and above all, usually cost, often in a way that drives up cost in programs. And yet that won't be the same in lots of countries because they exist in a different format. The reward functions in those organizations are quite different. And so you'll find risk taking and your example of, I think, facial recognition software and what it does and what it's allowed to be used for will vary a lot by the norms of the state that you're in and what they care about. So I think it'll definitely arrive unevenly. And that is a defense and security worry, but I think they'll be different by nation almost.
I'm gonna jump in here and take this opportunity then to ask you a question about the governance of AI, particularly at the international level. So I know you've all been involved at some level in thinking about frameworks for both the ethics and sort of the international governance of these systems. And we've had, well, any AI system, but we've had a lot of questions coming through about what bodies exist to do that. So I'm going to give you a question from Mark Ritchie, which again, as I say, kind of is similar to a lot of questions we're being asked, which is what bodies exist to govern the ethical deployment of AI solutions? And is there a body with more than just advisory powers that decides what can and can't be done? What I also add to that is given your involvement that all of you have had around such bodies, is whether you think existing bodies which don't necessarily address the ethics but are looking at perhaps frameworks are fit for purpose, in a sense, if I can put it that way. I'm thinking perhaps about the UN, the CCW there, and bodies like that. Would anyone like to go first on that question? So I'll read Mark's out again. What bodies exist to govern the ethical deployment of AI solutions? Is there a body with more than just advisory powers that decides what can and can't be done? Does anyone want to come in on that one?
I mean, I can go in very briefly and then pass on to Elke now, who'll know much more about it. I think the perspective from me is that there isn't really one that has that ability, and it's to all of our disadvantage. Even more so, I think, around the types of standards, particularly say around interoperability through to design standards, that I think are necessary as these technologies are developing at pace. And so we're developing them in isolation, even within allied nations. So all of these principles of war, particularly this notion of escalation management, how you de-escalate, are largely built on logics of human-to-human interaction and using some of the existing deliberative international bodies to air grievances. But as we start to develop software that takes some degree of autonomous action or influence, we're doing that in such isolation that we may accidentally escalate activities or undercut the ability of two humans to de-escalate activities on the international stage.
If it's okay, I'll come in. So in terms of whether there exists a body that kind of looks at the ethics of all of this, the US has pioneered a set of ethics principles for military AI use, which were crafted by the Defense Innovation Board and then were adopted by the Pentagon, I think, in 2019. And in some ways that's a good start, but the problem is always with any sort of ethics principles is that it kind of brackets a whole lot that should be covered. And that it can only reduce an ethical consideration to a principle, which in my eyes is not enough. And very often, I'm not saying that that's what the ethics principles are doing, but very often it runs the risk that it kind of serves as a fig leaf to indicate, yes, we've thought about ethics, here's what we've come up with. That's, you know, for me, that's a big danger and it's a big risk to kind of just package a very limited idea of ethics I alluded to in the beginning into what essentially is a technical document in itself as well. Others are trying to work on their ethics principles, but it's very tricky because, you know, when it comes to warfare and thinking through the ethics is notoriously thorny and difficult and complex, and so that it will always pose a challenge to make that coherent, I would venture to say. In terms of regulation, I think maybe Al can tell us a little bit more about that, but conversations are ongoing at the CCW as to where these limits and regulatory boundaries should be drawn when it comes to autonomous weapon systems, not necessarily AI. Generally speaking, for artificial intelligence, regulation is extremely difficult because it's a dual-use technology, right? It's not like this is the robot and let's ban this particular thing, but it is a system. It's a highly networked, intricate, diffuse system. So what are you going to regulate in the first place? So that makes it extremely challenging, and that's part of the reason why both the legal frameworks and the ethical frameworks are lagging quite far behind between, you know, what is aspired to happen, or what military organizations or defense organizations want to happen, between those slightly faster moving, unregulated private companies, and then the rest of us, if you will.
So I've a sneaky suspicion that Elke may be more current than me, so broadly speaking, I don't think there is a single organisation with any sort of authoritative power to answer the original question, having completely failed to answer the earlier question in the same way. I think your description of the problems is entirely right, Elke. So I would completely agree with that. And in some ways, there feels like there's this gap between the US's 5 principles that they've got, which the UK has sort of copied. They've got 5 principles as well. They haven't used completely the same words, but it does look a bit synonymical. The gap between that, I think, is in some ways a mirror of some of the problems that the UN sessions and attempts to create workable legislation have faced. You'll probably see in a lot of reporting where country X, Y, or Z is deemed to have blocked a move that's come in. Quite often those reports about, we would have had a law, but Russia or China or America or somebody stopped it, I think are quite often oversimplified, because the challenge from a legal perspective is exactly as you defined, Elke. It's about finding that boundary. And it's not just the dual use nature, it's the ability to find this position that people can turn into actionable legislation that on one side, say, for example, murder is nice and binary. Someone's dead or they're not dead. If they're not dead, it's not murder. If it was an accident, it's not murder. And so you can draw this neat delineation. The problem that has existed with the CCW has been things like, well, nobody wanted the Terminator, but nobody was arguing that we should be banning heat-seeking missiles. And the problem is that the idea of what constitutes a decision, what amounts to autonomy, which is a thing acting outside of control of a human, it becomes really difficult when you get to that middle line. And to have a law, you have to have a boundary, because it must sit within a bound set of context, otherwise it isn't a law. And that is where there's been this sort of permanent challenge. And it's interesting because if you go and have a look at the sort of the current legislation, which still exists and is really quite useful in bounding what is and isn't permissible, you get back to some of the old rules that were developed and have stood quite well. So they talk about the ability for a system to be used discriminately, for it to be used proportionately, for it to be used in line with military necessity. And then there's a thing called the Martin's Clause, which really, to save time, is kind of not unusually cruel or beyond the bounds of public conscience. And again, those feel like the sort of 5 principles that you had. And the reason that they exist in that way is because with non-AI technologies, often context made a huge difference to what the sort of software, hardware, machine assurance, all of the really dull, dry systems engineering stuff packaged together meant for an individual system. And how you package that together for a sea mine is completely different to how you package it together for a rifle. And so you'd end up with this vast federation of really technocratic material underneath it that was driving towards these very abstract principles. And the challenge, therefore, is if we treat AI as a kind of a unitary single object, we suddenly find it really difficult to have a kind of an AI boundary. But AI could mean all sorts of different things to different people. And that's where a lot of the challenges are in this. There's no shortage of activity in this realm, and it manifests as other things. So sometimes people said, oh, we can't solve the autonomy problem satisfactorily. Let's talk about meaningful human control. And everybody got very excited about 4 years ago about that change. And then they suddenly realized that we had the same boundary problem because we couldn't quite work out what was not quite meaningful enough human control. And so we constantly run into these boundaries issues associated with it. I think it's going to be a very difficult problem, and I think it's going to endure because I've seen nothing that fundamentally shakes that boundary issue in a legislative sense.
And if you drop down below that level of legislation into implementation, and then just take the example of NATO, the military alliance of 30 nations, just if they want to agree on interoperability standards and approach towards cyber, say, there are so many committees and organizations that there are almost approximately 700 representatives across those 30 nations who may have and have the right to have an opinion on those topics. So the implementation can be agonizingly slow, as even with an alliance that has quite a deliberate and specified aim.
Elke, I don't know if you wanted to come in to any of those points.
No, I agree with all of that. It's an extremely challenging issue. The discussions at the CCW amongst the governmental experts has in some ways just stalled, or at least very much slowed down. And a lot seem to have hinged on the question of, okay, what exactly is an autonomous weapons system, or a lethal autonomous weapons system, or as the current lingo is, the fully autonomous weapons system. And that in itself is a political issue, actually, how you define this. The UK famously has a very broad definition of what fully autonomous would constitute or be. Others have a more narrow definition of that. And in some ways that derails the concerns that are raised by, say, civil society groups. And that concern is quite clearly that no humans should be targeted by autonomous weapons systems. No humans should be targeted by systems that are pre-programmed or have a capacity to identify and take out human targets. That's where the line is drawn. And so in some ways, maybe we have to look at the practice and how we legislate for a certain practice, rather than, just kind of throwing our hands up in the air and saying like, well, we can't define autonomy, so best not try and get to the heart of the problem. I encouraged that the discussions, despite massive roadblocks, continue to go on. These things tend to be a longer process. That's just the way it is. But it is also quite frustrating. And, in some ways it is intractable.
Okay, not a very hopeful note to finish on with the governance there. So I just want to move away from this question of international governance over this system to think more about a specific problem that can arise in the use of AI systems. And I think, so we've got a question from James Chan here, which I think will allow us to try and grapple more with the questions of the sort of holistic analysis of these systems in a sort of wider ecologies. So the question from James Chan is, how would we avoid algorithmic bias arising from cultural stereotyping as to targeting and rules of engagement, such as signature strikes? We've just discussed the kinetic use of AI there. So I would just sort of modify this question slightly for our panelists to think more broadly about how do we address this question of algorithmic bias? And if the panel want to relate that to these lethal uses of AI, then that's your prerogative. But how would we avoid algorithmic bias, or how do we address that problem? Or what do we need to do to address that? Would anyone like to take that question first? It's a difficult one.
Like in my seminars.
There's no one else is going for.
Yeah, sorry, it's
that's one. So this is one of these things where it's very difficult to have a nice, neat answer, because it entirely depends on what your tool does and how it's structured as to how is where you face your risks, really, and they can exist in a sea of different ways. So there are these ideas of sort of Black Mirror-esque episodes where people are being miscategorized in some sort of dystopian, totalitarian future, and surprisingly, humans are perfectly capable of creating that. But it's probably not the most common risk. And to be honest, if you have a totalitarian society that's doing that sort of thing, I suspect you have all sorts of other problems associated with that. The challenges are probably going to be more subtle than that, though, in that you've got every prospect, I think, of reintroducing or essentially automating bad practice that exists elsewhere. And how that becomes a defense and security issue is, I think, more likely to manifest as a cause of conflict and strife in society and those sorts of problems and the capacity for misunderstanding between groups of people than it is to manifest as, you know, an array of as yet unconceived, unconstructed, undesigned missiles that when launched turn out to be racist to everyone's surprise, because this string of errors that you'd have to make to get to that unlikely set of circumstances are really, really extreme, as opposed to the capacity to use information processing systems in an organization that filter for what people think is useful information, but you haven't seen what is filtered out. You know, what you see is all there is a human heuristic, and this tendency for that sort of thing to propagate through an organization, not necessarily a military one, but one that could lead to decisions being made where there's incomplete data sets, I think are far more likely and a greater risk. They're also far more likely, or far more difficult to pick out in advance, I think, in some ways. And I suspect that's probably not a very satisfying answer to your question, but that's what I think the real risks are probably going to be.
No, I thought that was an excellent answer to the question. I see, Elke, that do you want to come in there?
Yeah, my answer is probably also not going to be so satisfying. I think it's an extremely challenging task because the bias happens at, or the potential for bias can happen at so many different points. It can happen at a purely technological level, right? So if you have bad data, bad training data, and you have no grounds for testing this data properly, then there will always be a relatively high level of some sort of type of bias. So these blind spots, and then you know, if you don't have a full and comprehensive understanding of you know, how you set your thresholds, and so unless there's a clear and full and comprehensive understanding of where the data is coming from, and that the data really reflects the plurality of, you know, the human collective that you want to wield the system onto, there will always be gaps with incomplete, inappropriate, inaccurate, inadequate data, bad training, inadequate modeling, inadequate testing. So that's kind of, these systems have that capacity, unfortunately, at every turn, twist and turn. And so that's one aspect. But it's also a problem that, you know, the human would use these systems or would draw on these systems, or, you know, reap the benefits from employing a system that is perhaps implicitly biased, but that is not so overtly biased, where the bias is a lot less visible. And, you know, employ a system in a setting where it's a lot harder after the fact to then identify, okay, that is clearly biased here. You know, this is what happened, bam, bam, bam. So I think the technology itself holds a capacity for a obfuscation, if you will, or for intransparency of practice.
Yeah, and I'm far from a tech utopian, but I actually think that the present way of doing things, which are solely human, are far more depressingly grotesque than the possibility posed by a machine doing aspects of them. And the level of scrutiny being applied to the ethics and biases of machine applications is far greater than the existing level of scrutiny applied to humans making these decisions. So I would be more optimistic. And I think the greater amount of work has to be done in making the humans within these organizations willing to accept data-driven recommendations. The levels of data literacy are so low, and the levels of human judgment, whether it's military judgment, are perceived as such high status that they would often override even the data that is making different recommendations. So I prefer to see more data, and there's a great deal of work around some of these organizations of making it explicit under notions of model cards on what algorithms are actually doing. which is part education, but also partly a level of scrutiny that does not apply to human decision-making chains.
Is it? Oh, sorry, Elke, you come in there.
Yeah, I probably would agree that that's the case at the present juncture, because, you know, AI ethics and the problem of bias and intransparency is so huge. But I would say that there is a bit of a diffusion of accountability and responsibility that is always present when systems are involved. And for me, importantly, the pushback is perhaps more easily applied when there's a clear line of human errors or human biases visible than when a decision is made that is suspected of being highly biased. Then you have to find the political will to go and figure out what has happened. You have to have the knowledge as to what has happened, and so on and so forth. So I think the possibility for contestation, political contestation, shrinks a little bit, and that's what worries me.
I've come to the end of our time there. Thank you very much, my panelists. That was hugely enjoyable. I wish we could have spent hours discussing these topics, but thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.